How are we going to start this?
This is Two Pastors Talk, Season 2. I don't know what episode this is, but we are starting the thing that we said we were going to do when we initially started talking about doing this podcast was talking about this book, The Patient Ferment of the Early Church by Alan Kreider. I picked this up, I don't know, year and a half ago, maybe. Oh no, it was longer than that. I was knee deep in
Oh,
my
well.
Roman series. That's what it was. I was knee deep in my Roman series, which was 2022, I think,
Yep.
and found this book and was just really kind of blown away. And honestly, was glad that I didn't discover it before my Roman series because I think it might have
You messed it up.
overtaken a lot of the things in the series. And as I was reading through, um, I realized how ignorant I was and am on early church stuff. So I reached out to my good friend uh, and hard rock and amigo, James Bozeman, Father James Bozeman. And I talked about this book. It was funny. I posted that photo of us last week that you sent me, and I'll post it.
Yeah.
I'll include it in this part of the video. But I posted that, and in my initial post, I said something like, James Bozeman, parentheses, now father. And that threw some people off because they were like, what? John's dad? What's going on? So then I went back in and changed it. Um, but yeah, so I reached out to Jamie here and we started talking about it. And then we started talking about a whole bunch of other things on our podcast. Um, and I think the bulk of everything we've talked about is what's the church? What's the church about? Um, how does the church function? How should the church function? Where do we get all of those things from? And obviously, I really go back to whatever episode that was when you used the word tradition, both of our
Mm,
traditions,
right.
because you're in your tradition now for close to 20 years,
Yeah.
I think.
Yep.
I'm in my tradition for a little less than 30. Um, but yeah, we just have different viewpoints on things, and I thought this book would be a good discussion. Um, so today we're just talking about the introduction and chapter one, both pretty brief. I don't know that that means anything for the length of this video, as prior as prior history has indicated.
Mm.
Um, so you were going to say something. You said, "I'll wait till I get into it." Oh, I'll wait till we get into it.
So, okay, the more important question, I think, to this will be the second question. The first question is like, so reading this through, I'm trying to understand where the author Kreider is coming from. Kreider, not Kreider, or is it Kreider? Kreider. Let's say Kreider.
It's whatever we say it is.
German. Kreider. Um, I know he's Mennonite, and
Mm-hmm.
I haven't gotten to the point. I've looked through the introduction too, but like, what is his? This is the lesser important question. Like, what is his goal here? Like, what is he
Mm.
after? From what you can tell, I
From
mean,
what I can
patience is a
tell,
big thing.
yeah, I think his thesis is the reason, like again, I just had that Phil Collins song "Against All Odds" in my head. Um, against, yeah, against any reasonable, like against the odds. So there it is,
Yeah,
against the
yeah,
odds.
yeah.
Against the odds, like Christianity should have died a miserable death at some point in the Roman Empire,
Gotcha.
and it didn't. And his thesis is it's because the church demonstrated something, specifically patience, in the way they whatever proclaim the gospel. I know we'll get into a little bit into evangelism. I really liked the way he kind of talked about that in chapter one,
Yep.
because there wasn't an evagelism plan, but it really seems to point to the reason that, I mean, obviously, as and I so you said he's so you know he's a Mennonite. So assuming his angle is Christian, obviously, the Jesus answer, we know that Jesus is the reason that Christianity is still around. Gates of hell won't prevail. All of those things are 100% true. And the Christians themselves functioned in certain ways that caused Christianity to be, I don't know, attractive. I don't know what word you would use. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
but for some reason, Christianity didn't die, and that's because Christians functioned in a certain way, and his book is going to tell us what that way is.
Okay. No, it makes sense too, because like I like that. In fact, before we got on, I had underlined in chapter one the title, "The Improbable Growth of the Church," which is,
Yeah.
totally makes sense. That makes more sense to that. Okay. So the
Mm.
second question then is for you. So like,
Mm.
what is it that like specifically for you drew you to this book and made you want to talk? I mean, we talked a little bit about that in the intro, but like more specifically for you, like what was it that really flipped the switch for you?
I think the thing that flipped the switch for me is um, thinking about the way that this might be a little in the weeds. This might be a little in the weeds for some three of our 16 listeners. Um, I think, I think, and maybe it's evangelical Christianity. For a really long time, culturally, evangelical Christianity was the bomb, right? Like that
Yeah.
was the prevailing story. We were evangelical Christians. We set the tone for the nation and constitution and all of that jazz here in the United States. And in the last 30 years, 30, 40 years, as modernity has crumbled, and the roots go way back into the Enlightenment and all that stuff. Um, I think there are a lot of Christians who are wrestling through what it looks like to to be Christians today. And I think especially for people who like, I don't always like using political terms, so I don't always mean when I say them. But I think like for probably right wing evangelicals, like we've had a lot of, I mean, we've had a lot of power in the last hundred plus years, and now that power is gone. And as we've as Christians and evangelical Christians have tried to figure out like how do we recover from this. It's about, for me, it's more about, it's not as so much as about recovering political power or all of those things, but like how can we recover what it means to be a follower of Christ? Like that's the for me, like that's the win in all of
Hmm.
this.
Yep.
And yeah, there may have been moments, a lot of moments, as evangelicals kind of kind of ruled the political debate and all of those things over the last 100 years. Well, now, like, when that's not when that narrative is no longer the prevailing narrative,
Right.
um, I just see this effort, and I don't want to make this a political thing because I think it applies to either side.
Mhm.
There's an effort that says, well, if we can gain or regain political power, then we can fix this whole thing.
Right.
And it's not. And this is part of my own journey. I don't remember what episode we talked about this in, but I mean, 30 years ago, I told you that I would have been all about that.
Yeah.
I mean, I was man. I listened to some Rush Limbaugh back in the day,
Oh yeah.
and and I had closely conflated my political thoughts with my religious thoughts. And looking back on that, I'm like, wow, that was a mistake.
Yeah. Yep.
And I don't think that what we ought to do is try and recover political power to bring about God's kingdom. We should just act like Christians.
Yeah.
So reading through
Yeah.
just reading through this book, it just gave me like a lot of things to think about, and I think it gave words to some thoughts that I had that I didn't know words for.
I mean, it's interesting when you read. I think in light of that too, you think about when you're reading like the Book of Acts. Like St. Paul didn't have any like any hesitance to make use of the state when it was
Yeah.
of benefit, you know. But he never. But his allegiances were so to Christ. You know, it was always about. I mean, I just finished up reading through Acts again, and you know, he ends up in Rome in the end. It's providential the way the whole thing works out, and yet it's at the same time it's the thing he wants to do. But it's clear that when you get from the time of the apostles until the time of Constantine, which again, while some people would be very negative about Constantine, he's one of our saints, and he also was not a perfect man, but a man who made the way open for us to have Christianity become what it is we enjoy today. But from that period, you had, I mean, obviously, you had a lot of suffering, and people weren't Christians. I think your point is good, and I think his point here will probably bear this out too. That what he sees as a Mennonite, I'll put it this way, and what I see as an Orthodox Christian historically, and I think what most historians would have to admit is, I mean, I don't know why they would argue this, is the Christians weren't about political power at that time.
Mm.
They suffered, they had to remain patient, and they, you know, my guess is they knew they would grow, but they also never expected growth to be sort of like the metric by which everything
Mm.
was going to prove positive. They were, you know, my one of my mentors, Father Thomas Hopko, always likes to talk about Christianity as like a remnant. It's always the few. It's always those who remain faithful that keep essentially heresy and everything else at bay. So yeah, it's interesting. That's an I get what you're saying, especially in this environment where, like you said, where I was in the same boat where you conflate Christianity with one side of politics.
Mm-hmm.
And then while I'll say it this way too, we have two sides in America, so we think at least it's basically one party, but just people say
Right.
different things in one party. And neither one of them is really actually in favor of what we as Christians are. I would say
Mm.
Christians, those of us who call ourselves Christians, really ought to be in favor of, except for there's certain things I actually do are nice when it happens. Um,
Sure.
you know, but those the Christians of the you know, the early church, which I still for whatever reason I want to come up with a better term, but from that period,
Mm.
that's just not what they thought. It's not how they acted. It's not
Yeah.
what they were doing. So I get it
Yeah.
though. I get what you're after.
Yeah. Yeah. A few years ago when we went through Acts, that was my first big series here. Um, we talked about the way Paul always, as a Roman citizen, Paul was never hesitant to bring that up, but
Yeah.
it was always about like this. I'm using my Roman citizenship to further the gospel. It
Yep.
was never about his. And even when he said, I don't remember what city it is. You just read it, so you'll probably be
Yeah.
more familiar with it.
Tell
But
me about
he's
it.
like, you know, we're Roman citizens. Those people need to come out and kick us out of town
Yes.
themselves, right?
Yes.
so so that whole thing of using his he wasn't saying I have these. He wasn't saying, and I don't know if they have the right to free speech. I think as Christians today, we tend to view our rights as American, like I have the right to free speech, ergo, I can say whatever I want to. Now, if that is, I can say whatever I want to and I can proclaim the gospel, that's one thing. But I'm not like just because everything is beneficial or just because I'm allowed to do all things doesn't mean everything is
Yep.
beneficial.
Yep.
So Paul always I just noticed when I was reading that, man, just the way he utilizes his citizenship is always about the furtherance of the gospel. And um I think in American like whatever our Americanized version of Christianity is, we don't always use our rights as American citizens to further the gospel. We make it about the rights. Well, I have the right to do this. I have the
Yeah.
right to do this.
Yeah.
And it would be, it'd be worthwhile for our Christian friends to go like spend a little time in Acts and see actually how Paul did that,
Yeah.
um, and utilize our rights to further the gospel.
Well, you think about it too. I mean, I would say it this way, and I've said this before in church, as Christians, we've abdicated our rights in a real sense. Like
Mm,
we don't have we've given up our rights. Now we still
mm,
have things that we can do. Like St. Paul he's actively using his citizenship, like you said, but his whole motivation is for the kingdom of God. So it's like he can take all that and say, well, what can how can I use that? How can that become a way to manifest this? Even while he's like always talking, like I'm going through Corinthians, as you know, Corinthians, you've done that too. He talks about that, where the off scouring, all the stuff that he uses, these terms he uses, where he, at the same time he's able to claim like we have these rights, but we're choosing to not use. I mean, this is among the Christian community. We're choosing to not use these rights, and we're
right,
demonstrating that these other things come first.
right.
Which
Yeah,
I think the thing about the early Christians was, among other things, was just their tendency to um, befuddle the Roman
mm,
world with love, with care for people that other people didn't care for, for providing for people, for sharing of their stuff. We're in a society that looked down on that sort of thing.
right. Yeah, and you said we don't have rights. I think it's important. Um, like if I were watching this and you made that statement, um, a reasonable question would be, well, where do we get that from? And
Yeah.
just it's First Corinthians 6, and it's not only Paul certainly is talking about sexuality and sexuality issues, but it's much deeper than that. You do not belong to yourself, for God bought you with a high price. You must honor God with your body.
Yep.
So when I think about my rights, yeah, I don't have. I mean, I do, but I don't. I'm to subordinate what those rights are for the good of the gospel, and that that's just as I've been processing this, because for me this seriously has been like a really long journey.
Yeah.
Um, like just subordinating those rights and giving those rights up and realizing, yeah, I do have a certain set of rights, but for the good of the gospel, I might subordinate them. And
Yep.
this might even be a. I know COVID was 4 years ago. Um, how, yeah,
Yeah, I
how,
mean, that's a good example. I mean, it was an
it,
opportunity for us, even if we didn't like any of the ideas, to be able to say, I must decrease in order that
yeah,
other people, even if we disagree with the way it went, and we have many views on that, and I'm perfectly comfortable with all that. But yeah, I mean, there's that point where you have to say that's not. If there's anything that would push against the way we did things, it was not one about rights. It was more about what's right and wrong, or maybe we could argue about those things. But yeah, I think
sure.
it's a good example. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think just thinking about that, um, did I put my rights as a citizen above, um, I mean, and this, I don't know, this just
Yeah.
isn't as controversial as I've made it up in my head right now. We're just kind of winging this. Like, I mean, am I giving up my rights for the good of other people?
Yeah.
And yeah, not obviously there were some age groups that were more susceptible to COVID-19 than others, and some people's situations that were more susceptible to that. And the question, I think that like it would have just been a better question without all the political nonsense of, isn't it like isn't it like my friend who, I mean, we had this. Um, one of our pastors was had lung cancer
Yeah.
and ended up passing away, died at the end of 2020. And is my right so important to me that I'm not going to take protective measures when I'm around that person?
Yep.
I mean, that's even to ask that. The fact that someone would have to ask that question is just utterly foolish.
Yeah.
Because of course I should subordinate my right
Yeah.
to
Yep.
not wear protective measures for the sake of the other person. But the problem is all the other, and now yeah, boy, we're talking about this book and now we went off here. But like I mean, just all the other stuff that came up. But I think I think this is, it's maybe it's not as far off the path.
No, I don't
Um,
think so. I don't think so.
I mean, it really is like how am I utilizing my rights? Am I utilizing my rights to proclaim the gospel? And that doesn't just mean my ability to say something, which is what I think the whole purpose of this book is. Like I proclaim the gospel in the way that I love my neighbor, in the way that I am patient with people who aren't like me.
Yeah. Yep.
And how can we like try and recover and realize that no, the way you respond to things actually is a proclamation of the gospel.
Hmm. Well, he talks about that too in the introduction, which I thought was interesting because he talks, like I underlined, oh, he has like 4 points in there. But
Mm-hmm.
one of the things, the first one was like I guess he's talking about the growth of Christianity and what people put like name as the causes for this, and
Mm-hmm.
he sort of puts his own in there. The first one was patience, which was on page one actually,
Yep.
but the
Yep.
second one, interestingly, and as an Orthodox Christian, I kind of laugh because it's funny. His second point he calls habitus, which I like that word. I guess it's Latin for habit, and he
Okay.
calls it reflexive bodily behavior. And as Orthodox Christians, we would call this works.
Mm. Okay.
So I think he's trying to avoid that word. But his point's really good. Like he talks about how their behavior, which
Mm.
like he says was habitual behavior, traditional. It's a tradition. I did I get a thumbs up? I didn't do anything. That was weird. Um he talks about it that way.
I was thinking
He was
about
thinking it.
giving you a thumbs up, so that's what it was.
That's what happened. It came through. That's scary. But this idea, where I mean, I think his points are really kind of good. Patience was one where it was contrary to the way of the world at the time. Their works, their reflexive bodily behavior. So people are seeing how they're acting,
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the Christians would say, well, look at what we do. This should tell you something about us. And then the third one was catechesis and worship. So how they taught. I like, he's got some interesting stuff in there as an Orthodox Christian that he points out. I'm like, yeah, I totally get that, particularly. And then that fourth term was ferment, which is the thing which is an interesting term because he calls it the bubbling energy that um
Mm-hmm.
it takes time. It takes the right ingredients for something to ferment. It takes, well, patience, it's back to patience again. Um, it takes care, to do that. So you can't we talk about rights. Like I would say it this way, a Christian abdicates in the world, a Christian is abdicating his the rights he could justifiably say I have. Like I have this right, but I'm going to, and it's justifiable and I can claim it and I could actually claim it and stick with it, but I'm going to let go of that right because in some way by letting go of this right, I'm convinced or convicted or have discernment that somehow this is going to help, forward the kingdom of God and will help people come to Christ.
Right.
For the Orthodox priests, we um things that we give up, in part are like, I mean, I wear a cassock and a cross all the time now. I'm glad to do it, but I much prefer just wearing my street clothes, like like you do or like others do. But for us, it's like it's our uniform. It's like you end up giving up that right because you're doing something. The whole goal of it isn't to like, well, it makes you look weird, but that's okay. But that weirdness is supposed to both guide the priest, but also guide the people who are around them. So we have this obviously this tradition. So for some of us, like I would say myself particularly, like I'm much more comfortable in other things, but this is really, especially in the South in the summertime, this thing's warm. But it's one of those ways we can give up that, you as a pastor, you're giving up time you could justifiably say is yours, that anybody else would call their own, you're giving that up, or you're giving, sometimes people don't really get it too. We as pastors, like I had the band, I wanted to kind of keep that going, but at the same time I had this calling, and you can't really do both easily, although we've kind of proved that sort of wrong, but not totally.
Yeah.
But really not. I mean, at the same time, like, we would love to get together more often. We don't have time, And I'm thankful for the band, because it's a way for the three of us as priests, but also the other two members too, for the five of us, so we can get together and do stuff together and have something outside of just the work. But that's by far, I mean, it's a sacrifice. I mean, I still got the guitars, but I really hardly pick them up anymore. So I mean, there's sacrifices, rights that we give up, as pastors. People don't really often get that, but
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Am I drawing
Yeah.
it? I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I like the way I like the way you talked about ferment and just that time. I was
mhm.
having a conversation with someone yesterday who was asking me about starting a college aged small group here.
Right.
And we kind of talked we talked about that. Excuse me. And what I encouraged him to do was, well, I think the best way to do that is to start building a relationship with those students,
Yep.
and just over time, like just ask them if they want to do that. Just
Yeah.
and he
Yeah.
said, and he very quickly said two things. He said, well, that's a really slow way to do it, and it's also a very biblical way to do it.
Yeah.
So I think there are times where what we want to do in the church, and this is something that we actively here at Westway, it's something that we actively try and push back against. You're not going to shortcut this,
Yeah. Yep.
and and the way that things develop best is relationally and over time, and you'll, like he's talking about in this book, you'll probably achieve the goal um, better if you if you don't try to if you don't try to um, if you don't try to rush the process.
Yeah.
And I think just reading through these things, patience, habitus, or works, catechesis and worship and ferment is, um, like I think and this it gets into this in chapter 1 where it talks about they didn't have an evangelism plan,
Yep.
and I think they didn't have an evangelism plan, and this is just going to be sound really general, because they were just living like transformed people, like
Yeah.
people who had been transformed by Jesus. The
Well,
Holy Spirit was dwelling in them, and they were just doing their thing, and they just happened to have Jesus.
you have to bear in mind too. Like one of the things I would add to that too, because I think that's absolutely the truth. You have to. And this is where I think history comes in, and of course, I'm Orthodox, so I'm going to present this from what at least I think is a reasonable way. But they're Jews, right? So Christ comes into their life. They've had this way of living, which involved a liturgical way of living. So this
Mm-hmm.
is partially an argument for the way the Orthodox do things, but also too, I think a way to sort of, I would hope, will kind of give great, whether people accept Orthodox the way it works or not, will give greater attention to what's like actually going on. So these people are Jewish, fully Jewish, um, very much when they were Orthodox in that sense of the word. So Christ comes along, he himself knows where to set aside the Pharisaical ways of doing things. Like, why do your disciples not fast? John, we Pharisees and John the Baptist Pharisees are all fasting. They're not fast. Well, Christ says, while the bridegroom is with them, they can't fast. So there's a rule of fasting that everyone's supposed to be doing, but Christ himself has set something aside to say, right now, that's not appropriate. But believe me, he says, they're going to fast. It's going to happen. And that's what happens after that. So their fasting, will happen later. But they're living this liturgical life. Christ comes into their life. He doesn't explain everything clearly to them. They're absorbing this. Ultimately, he dies, is resurrected, basically says, I told you so, and then it ascends into heaven after 40 days. And all of a sudden, then the Pentecost happens, and suddenly, like all of a sudden, with the filling of the Holy Spirit, everything that was kind of starting to fall into place was all starting to drop. All the pennies dropped. And so Peter preaches, and they continue on. We've talked about in Acts, where it says they continued on. And one of the things it mentions is the prayers, which we would say was the liturgical life of a Jew who is now also what would become called a Christian, someday in Antioch. And so they're living liturgically. They're still going to the temple, or the synagogue. They're hearing the reading of the scriptures, but there's clearly, there's not a divide between the Christian community and the Jewish community in the sense that there's two separate things at this stage. But gradually over time, those things break apart to the point now where as Christians, we do not, I would say this as an Orthodox Christian, a Jewish person, God bless them, is not a Christian. Like they're not,
Sure.
they're two different things, particularly today. At the time, they were more of a sect, but they have this way of, my whole point of this is to say is when you see in Acts, like they're living this, what we would call a very rich, religious, spiritual, liturgical life that now is added in, maybe from this side, now is added in all the things that Christ has taught, has illumined them, so on Saturday, they're going to the synagogue, they're going to the temple, and then from what we can see in a lot of the documents, then they're adding to this on Sunday, gathering together to break bread in the Eucharist. So like you've got this community that's actually, they're doing their thing, and it's like all this stuff, it's like their eyes are open to the meaning of all this stuff, That's the whole point. So I think what's happening, I mean, clearly part of what's happening is like finally the faith that God had given the people of God on Mount Sinai, and that they'd followed all those years and had followed through all kinds of suffering, obviously in Christ, first really revealed through John the Baptist, and then later in Christ kind of saying, here it all is. And then his resurrection, suddenly like you got this people are going, aha, we've got it. Now we see. So there's like, I mean, I guess that's the thing about, to tie it way back into the introduction again, like when he talks about catechesis and worship, like he talks in here about on the bottom of page 2, well, we're only 2 pages in. He talks about prayers in the Eucharist, so prayers and communion, the service of the communion, which were the heart of their services were not willy-nilly. They had context for how to pray because they'd already been doing that as Jews. But he talks about how these services weren't open to the catechumens, which are the people that were supposed to become Orthodox, or to Christian, I should say. And even today with the Orthodox, the catechumens who are wanting to become Orthodox, technically stay in the church service till a point, and then we have a dismissal where we send them out. Now, if there's nowhere for them to go, they just go to the back of the room, basically, and stand in the back. But the idea was they would be sent out to be taught something because they weren't ready to hear the rest of what was going on. And so again, it implies like a patience within the greater patience. Like even now, like when I've got people come into the Orthodox church and they go, I discovered Orthodoxy online and I love this guy and that guy, and I'm into icons and I'm ready to become Orthodox. And I'm like, okay, well, come to church, stand over here by the side, watch everything. Yeah. And they're like, well, how long is this going to take? I'm like, I don't know. Maybe a year, we'll see how you do. Because, for us, it's a little different. We're not getting people to make decisions for Christ. It's not how the Orthodox Church works. It's more about you're already here. Okay, you've come here. And I think this is what we see in this book too. He's kind of attesting to this. You're here, you're in the right place. Now it's time to grow. Take your time. Don't rush. Don't skip steps. Otherwise you'll fall away quickly. I guess that's my whole point in saying this. I like I like how he's clarifying this, even though probably in his Mennonite tradition they don't do any of these sorts of things. That's certainly what they did then, and it's still what we do in our church now. And the biggest enemy I have to people coming inquiring about the faith is impatience, the
Yeah.
unwillingness to wait. Like, give it to me now. Just give me the book. Give me the right book, and I'll read the book, and we can just, like, nope, gotta wait. It's gonna take time. Gotta form. You got to do the
Right.
thing for a while.
Right. Well,
Just,
so I'm totally okay that we're just going to make it through the introduction today. Um, and I guess a question I don't have in the time that we have left.
yeah, I say that.
Um, like we don't see, I think when we're reading through Acts, and maybe this is a brief conversation and we can pick up here next time.
Right.
Like when we're reading through Acts, um, we don't see a long drawn out process.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
so what he is talking about is probably maybe I don't know what you would call it. You said early church, and you used another phrase in a previous video, and I wish I could remember what it was because it was better. It wasn't better. It was a better word. Um, like really, what we're seeing is in this book and what he's talking about, and in these activities. I think he's really talking about the church age, like not the initial acts of Paul preaches to the Philippian jailer and he becomes a follower of Christ. Like we're
Right.
probably, is it safe to say that this is 20 years, 30 years, 40 years um after the kinds of things we're seeing in the book of Acts as far as people becoming Christians?
I think so.
Is
Because
that
things,
fair to say?
yeah, because, the church you see in the beginning of Acts is different from what you see at the end,
Yeah.
So it's like, even that, like, if you read it through and have that in mind, a lot of things change and things rightly develop. But I think probably that's probably what he's getting at is because as you go along, you're realizing like, okay, how do we start out, we didn't know who was going to do this. And now we got 10,000 people. Now we got 40,000 people. Now we got a 500,000 people, and that's things change with that. So yeah, I would say what he's getting at is as time went on, and as people continue to simply know they have to wait for Christ's return, you know, that's what they're trying to kind of address that and the need for that. And they've got time.
Yeah. So this is more not only,
Yeah.
not only. But in a lot of ways, we're seeing, I don't know, maybe an organizational structure enter into this, which they most likely had some version of this in Judaism in the Old Testament.
Oh yeah. Well, you can't avoid it in Acts because you got bishops and presbyters and deacons, and
Mm.
you've got people who they're running into problems. The people are getting
Yeah,
angry. The Greeks are like, they're not taking care of us. And the apostles are like, we can't be doing, waiting tables. Let's make deacons, and deacons can do this. That'll be their ministry. And,
right.
so stuff has to sort of develop. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Even for
Yeah.
Orthodox to say nothing ever changes. Well, things change. I mean, they do change, but the truth doesn't change.
Hmm. Cool. Well, um, those four things: patience, habitus, or works. I like that. That's good. Um, Catechesis and worship and ferment, kind of being ready in the long game and recognizing that ultimately, like it's about making disciples or making Christians,
Yeah.
maybe over time. Um, I'm looking forward to this discussion because it very much like I kind of said at the beginning, like it scratches an itch for me of how to think about what our own, yeah, especially like for me, like what our discipleship piece looks like. And
Right.
going back to that conversation I had with that person yesterday, like it's a slow thing, and it was really cool because he's the one that said it,
Yeah. Yep.
which tells me that like as a church. there are people who are beginning to understand like what we're doing, like we're in this for the long haul,
Hmm.
and it's not a quick fix. Discipleship isn't a quick thing. It's a long, slow thing that takes place. Um, and then the questions come like, well, how? Um, and I know our how's different, but I also know it's not that simple. It's not just that our
Yeah.
how's are different.
Yep.
Um, our two traditions do look at things differently, and I think that's going to be something that really comes up as we go through
Mhm.
this. Um,
It'll
and
be
that's the
interesting.
thing that I'm excited to talk about. Um, and I hope that our 16 people who are going to watch this will equally be excited. So
They will be thrilled.
yeah, so we will pick up in chapter one. We made it through, I think, 4 pages. So we're going to pick up in chapter one next time. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. We'd love for you to like, follow, subscribe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we will catch you next time.